Hey guys, tonight we will delve deep into a true story, one filled with horror and ultimate pain, the tragic end of a king who once created wonders, yet also relentlessly sowed terror. In the annals of human history, few deaths have been as horrifying, as gruesome, or as symbolically profound as the final days of Herod the Great. This king built imperishable wonders for his own glory, but was also the very man who murdered his own children out of relentless paranoia. Herod did not die peacefully in his sleep. No, his end was 10,000 times worse. Try closing your eyes and picture a death so agonizing that even hardened servants could not bear it and had to turn away. Imagine the sight of a body gradually rotting, decomposing into a color of necrotic black and blue, the color of necrosis, covered by the jaundiced yellow hue of liver failure, while the heart still beats. The sickly sweet stench of putrefying flesh spread throughout the room, causing extreme revulsion. The most terrifying thing is, he remained completely conscious, forced to listen to the constant squirming, wriggling sounds of the creatures devouring his body from the inside. This is not legend. This is the documented, historical end of the most feared tyrant of the ancient world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Herod the Great, born Herod, son of Antipater and Cypros, came into the world around 74 before the Common Era, in Caesarea Maritima, a newly founded port city under Roman rule. His father, Antipater, hailed from the Idumean nobility, governed the Idumea district, and had converted to Judaism with Rome's approval. His mother, Cypros, belonged to the Nabatean elite, and was renowned for her mastery of Middle Eastern painting and poetry. Herod was the youngest of at least two sons, the elder being Phasael, and may have had one or more lesser recorded sisters. Despite their lofty status, the Antipater-Cypros family were not of pure Davidic descent, a fact that drew persistent suspicion from the traditional Jewish priesthood and aristocracy. From early childhood, Herod's parents sent him to Jerusalem to study under Jewish sages and Greek tutors. He became fluent in Aramaic, the common tongue of Judea, in Greek, the lingua franca of Mediterranean trade, and later acquired Latin during a period of study in Rome. In approximately 39 before the Common Era, Antipater arranged for his son to reside at the court of Emperor Augustus. There, Herod received instruction in diplomatic protocol before the Roman Senate, the political writings of Cicero, Stoic philosophy, and the medical theories of Hippocrates. These formative years not only sharpened his strategic thinking, but also forged vital connections with Roman officials. Upon his return to Jerusalem, Herod quickly demonstrated exceptional skill in both economic administration and public works. According to the historian Flavius Josephus, he collaborated with Syrian engineers and Greek physicians to design a network of roads, aqueducts, and an academic precinct offering Alexandrian mathematics and Greek philosophy courses. These achievements solidified his reputation well before his formal elevation to the Judean throne. In 37 before the Common Era, following the Roman removal of Antigonus II of the Hasmonean line, Augustus Caesar appointed Herod as king of Judea. The coronation at Jericho combined Jewish ritual and Roman ceremony. He first donned the sacred tallit to pray at the tomb of the guardian, then adopted the Roman toga to receive his imperial seal. At 37 years old, Herod was deemed mature enough both in education and experience to shoulder the burdens of leadership. Historians regard this appointment as a political marvel, not only because of Roman backing but also because he alone could bridge imperial security concerns and Jewish aspirations for autonomy. Yet the new reign immediately exposed dynastic tensions. Traditional Jewish nobles derided Herod as lacking Davidic lineage, while commoners praised his social welfare initiatives. During a severe famine in 40, before the Common Era, he famously melted down more than 1 metric ton of gold to purchase grain from Egypt, winning the gratitude of the poor. At the same time, he ruthlessly executed alleged conspirators, often on mere rumor to enforce order and deter dissent. Herod's consolidation of power extended to his marital alliances. He married 10 times, primarily to Hasmonean and Idumean princesses, aiming to legitimize his rule through prestigious blood ties. However, these unions never dispelled all suspicion. In 26 before the Common Era, he ordered the execution of his most beloved wife, Mariamne, her mother, and their two sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, citing fears of betrayal. This horrific purge plunged him into guilt and paranoia, deepening his fear of losing authority and intensifying his isolation. Driven by anxiety over his origins and threatened rule, Herod embarked on an ambitious program of monumental architecture and brutal suppression. He rebuilt the Second Temple in Jerusalem, its platform spanning 230 meters in length and rising 60 meters in height, later celebrated among the Seven Wonders of Judea. He constructed the port of Caesarea Maritima using underwater hydraulic concrete and fortified the remote cliff-top fortress of Masada. These enduring symbols of his power would stand for centuries. From this foundation of personal background, education, and lineage, Herod entered the zenith of his reign, yet also awakened the latent anxieties that would plague him ever more fiercely. When illness finally struck, he would discover that no amount of power could preserve life, and that ultimate fear would become the spectre of his coming days. At the end of 5 before the Common Era, Herod began to experience a creeping, unrelenting itch that spread across his entire body, but concentrated most fiercely in his buttocks and groin. According to the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, the king would scratch himself until his skin bled, a vivid sign of urea accumulating in the blood due to his failing kidneys. His skin took on a yellowish hue, his energy waned, and yet the royal physicians, steeped in the theories of Hippocrates and Galen, responded with measures wholly inadequate to the task. They performed bloodletting, hoping to rebalance the four humours, and applied hot oils and powdered herbal poultices intended to cool his overheated flesh. But none of these remedies brought relief. As the itch persisted, more alarming symptoms emerged. A dull ache in his lower abdomen gradually intensified into excruciating, stabbing pains that made it impossible for him to stand erect. Each wave of agony radiated outward from his pelvic region down through his inner thighs, feeling sharper and more violent than any battlefield wound he had ever known. Night after night, Herod would lie awake, tormented, tossing and turning on the royal bed, whispering cries of pain that reverberated through the palace corridors. His once robust appetite vanished, and the once imposing figure of the king grew gaunt and hollow-cheeked, his eyes sunken and devoid of their former commanding sparkle. Meanwhile, the court was thrown into whispered panic. No one could name the disease, yet rumours of the king's rapid decline spread like wildfire among the common people, undermining the fragile peace and security he had worked so hard to maintain. Despite the agony racking his body, Herod struggled to project an image of unshakable authority. He issued secret execution orders to eliminate suspected conspirators, summoned his officials who approached the throne with trepidation to hear his decrees, and even revised his will repeatedly to guard against any potential plot by his children to seize power. Through these frantic efforts, one could glimpse the profound despair and confusion gripping the mind of a ruler once celebrated for his unbreakable will. Herod's nights of fitful sleep were punctuated by the sound of scratching, the rustle of linen as he shifted positions, and the soft, anguished moans that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. He refused to show weakness in public, yet those closest to him could see how his strength ebbed away. His skeletal frame, once draped in lavish robes and heavy cloaks, now appeared weighed down by the very fabrics that were supposed to signify his grandeur. Every movement was an ordeal, each breath a reminder of the slow decay overtaking his flesh. By that time, it was clear that the disease had escaped the realm of ordinary ailments. The royal physicians, once confident in their mastery of humoral balance, were now reduced to charlatans armed only with cold compresses and aromatic unguents that did nothing but aggravate the burning itch. They consulted older texts, debated when to perform additional bleedings, and even tried experimental poultices at the recommendation of visiting scholars, yet nothing halted the progression. Their failure only deepened Herod's paranoia. He suspected betrayal in every shadow, convinced that court physicians might be poisoning him or withholding a cure. The palace, once a place of splendor and ceremony, had become a stage for fear and uncertainty. Guards patrolled the corridors more frequently, looking for signs of unrest. Servants moved about in hushed tones, rarely meeting one another's eyes. The whisper network among the palace staff grew so extensive that sheaves of unofficial memos scribbled on scraps of papyrus passed discreetly from hand to hand, tracking each new symptom as if charting the fall of an empire. Despite everything, Herod remained adamant that his rule endure beyond his suffering. He issued new laws, allocated funds for grain distributions to refugees fleeing conflict in neighboring territories, and planned yet another monumental building project, this time an aqueduct to bring fresh water into Jerusalem. In his mind, every decree issued from his bedchamber was a bulwark against the chaos that threatened to swallow his kingdom the moment he faltered. And so, in the dim candlelight of his private chambers, the once supreme sovereign was trapped in a blistering cycle, an itch that burned day and night, a pain that tightened around his waist like a vice, and a mind racing with fears of betrayal and extinction. His body betrayed him in ways that no amount of power, wealth, or architectural marvels could ever prevent. The disease, invisible yet utterly overpowering, was rapidly eclipsing the legacy of the greatest builder Judea had ever known, reducing him to a shadow of himself, a man ensnared by the merciless advance of his own deteriorating flesh. In the next part, we will witness the further deterioration of his health as the disease's grip tightens, bringing with it complications that will push both king and kingdom to the brink of collapse. Just a few weeks later, Herod developed severe edema that transformed his once mighty frame into something almost unrecognizable. His legs swelled to such a degree that his royal sandals could no longer be fastened, and his abdomen distended so dramatically that he appeared with child. According to the medical theories of Hippocrates and Galen embraced at the time, edema was thought to result from an imbalance of the body's four humours. To correct this, the palace physicians attempted a series of treatments. Acupuncture needles were inserted to draw off excess blood, bloodletting was performed to reduce supposed surpluses, and pressure points were manipulated in an effort to restore harmony. Herbal concoctions, promising to evict dampness, circulated through the palace corridors, and poultices rich in myrrh and willow bark were applied to his swollen limbs. Yet each measure proved fruitless. The swelling persisted, unyielding, as if the very fluids of his body conspired against him. At the physician's recommendation, the king was urged to journey to the hot springs of Khalir, nearly 20 Roman miles to the east of Jericho, on the shores of the Dead Sea. These springs were famous throughout the ancient world for their steaming, sulfur-rich waters, believed to possess remarkable curative powers for ailments of the skin, joint pain, and disorders of the blood. It was a hope born of desperation rather than certainty, yet Herod, a proud sovereign, accustomed to bending the wills of men and the course of rivers, agreed to attempt this final recourse against his swelling limbs. The trip to Khalir, however, quickly devolved into a waking nightmare. Herod's legs, bloated beyond bearing, made riding a horse impossible. Instead, he was carried in a litter, a wooden sedan chair, fitted with cushions hoisted upon the shoulders of 4 of his strongest bearers. Each step they took, every uneven stone or rut in the road, sent jolts through his body. The movement caused fresh waves of pain radiating from the festering wound in his groin, where the underlying condition had already begun the slow work of tissue death. Passers-by along the route were struck by the foul odour emanating from the litter, a stench of decay so strong that those unaccustomed to it found themselves retching or covering their noses with cloth. When the party finally arrived at Khalir, the spring pools lay nestled in a rocky grotto, steam drifting upward like pale spectres in the early morning light. The attendants gently lowered Herod into the warm water, hoping the mineral-rich spring would soothe his aches and draw out the toxins believed to be poisoning him. But no sooner had the heat enveloped his battered flesh than he convulsed violently, seized by a sudden wave of shock. His limbs jerked and spasmed, his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness. Panic spread through his retinue. Servants rushed to drag him from the basin, certain he had breathed his last. After a time, Herod's breath returned, shallow at first, then more robust, as though he were granted a reprieve from death itself. But the ordeal in the hot spring left him in even worse plight than before. The hoary pools of Khalir, renowned for healing, had instead inflamed the tissue around his wound. When he regained full awareness, he found his groin area burning more fiercely than ever, a firestorm of pain that no balm could quench. Raising trembling hands, he swore never again to submit himself to the promise of those waters. Herod's retreat from Khalir was marked by a profound sense of futility. His body, once the instrument of empire and grand construction, lay ravaged by forces no amount of royal command could control. The procession back to Jericho mirrored the outbound journey in every grisly detail. The rattle of the litter's flooring, the stench of infection, the urgent whispers among the bearers. By the time he returned to the palace, his vitality was spent. He was reduced to a gaunt figure, wrapped in heavy cloaks to conceal his distended limbs, yet still unable to hide the contours of suffering beneath. Within the walls of Jericho, the courtiers exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers circulated that the king's condition had worsened beyond remedy, that perhaps even the power of Rome could not forestall his demise. Political alliances frayed, as each noble faction pondered the implications of Herod's possible death. Clutching their scrolls and seals, they wondered who among them would emerge from the inevitable succession crisis with fortunes intact. Meanwhile, Herod lay in his private chambers, stripped of his usual trappings of majesty, confronted by the stark realization that no palace physician, no oracle of empire, could stand between him and the inexorable laws of nature. In those days at Jericho, the contrast between Herod's former greatness and his current weakness could not have been more stark. He who had built ports in the sea and fortified palaces on rocky plateaus was now carried like a fragile child, eclipsed by the very body that once carried him to power. His journey to Calia remained a testament to the limits of human ambition in the face of mortality, a sovereign humbled by the swelling of his own flesh, destined to face the next chapters of his life, in a realm defined no longer by gilded halls, but by the ever-tightening vice of disease. After returning to Jerusalem, Herod's condition took a horrific turn. The flesh around his groin and scrotum began to die, slowly turning a deep purplish black. The skin became taut and glistening, exuding a sour, putrid odor that filled his private chambers. These symptoms match precisely what modern medicine would recognize as Fournier's gangrene, a rapidly progressing necrotizing infection of the genital and perineal region. In this condition, bacteria invade deep tissue layers, cutting off blood flow and releasing enzymes that liquefy connective tissue. Without an adequate blood supply, the skin and fat literally begin to rot, creating an ever-expanding zone of decaying flesh. The royal physicians, trained in the classical Greek medical tradition, found themselves utterly outmatched. They attempted surgical excision of the dead tissue with small blades, removing chunks of blackened flesh in the hopes of halting the spread. Yet every new incision only enlarged the open wound, exposing more healthy tissue to contamination by flies and airborne pathogens. Each morning, the royal surgeons would awaken to find fresh necrosis at the wound's edges, as if the disease were growing stronger by the hour. They dressed the area with poultices of wine and myrrh, believing the alcohol might disinfect, but these applications burned fiercely on exposed nerve endings and did nothing to slow the decay. Despite the agony that racked his body, Herod strove to maintain a veneer of composure. He would wince and draw in a breath as the surgeons probed the gangrenous patches, yet he never cried out. Instead, he uttered only low moans, each one laden with the weight of his fading dignity. He forbade any mention of his condition beyond the palace walls, fearing that news of his disease would embolden enemies and shatter the morale of his subjects. Still, whispers spread through the streets like wildfire. "The king is rotting alive," people murmured in taverns and marketplaces, glancing over their shoulders in dread. Each passing day saw Herod's once regal frame diminish further. Courtiers reported that the smell of death clung to his person so strongly that attendants wore masks soaked in rosewater just to enter his chambers. When a scribe arrived to bring him yet another draft of his will, he would collapse outside the door, gagging and breathless from the pungent stench. Herod's own reflection in a polished bronze mirror must have been unrecognizable. A gaunt figure wrapped in royal robes that hung like funeral shrouds, skin drawn so tight it threatened to tear at the slightest movement. Yet even as his flesh surrendered to decay, Herod's pen continued to scratch on parchment. He dictated will after will, first favoring his son Archelaus, then pivoting to Antipas, then to Philip, each revision more frantic than the last. Unable to write himself, he relied on trembling secretaries, pressing his signet ring into hot wax to seal every document, instructing messengers to deliver these dying decrees to various palace wards. He hoped to forestall intrigue among his heirs. But in doing so, he only sowed greater confusion, as each faction interpreted the latest version as their guarantee of succession. During these dark hours, the corridors of the palace transformed into a theatre of fear. Guards moved in pairs, as if afraid to enter alone. Servants scurried about with wide eyes, exchanging frantic glances before hurrying past. The grand marble halls, once resonant with triumphant proclamations, now echoed with the soft drip of infected fluids and the distant, muffled sobs of those who loved him or feared him most. Courtiers whispered that the decay had spread beyond his groin, creeping along his inner thighs and lower abdomen, as if his body were an altar to godless entropy. In the grip of such relentless suffering, Herod still summoned his council for occasional audiences. He would receive petitions for grain shipments, approve allocations for new aqueducts, and issue orders to the garrison at Masada. Each gesture was meant to affirm that his authority remained unbroken. His advisers, pale and unsteady, dared not suggest that the king might be beyond saving. Yet when he reclined on his deathbed like bier to sign yet another will, they saw in his hollow eyes the certainty of impending doom. Through it all, the necrosis advanced in silence, like frost creeping over a dying landscape. The coloration shifted from dark purple to coal black. Ulcers festered and bubbled, and a swarm of flies hovered in a trembling cloud above him. Even the physicians noted that this was no ordinary gangrene. It advanced with a speed that would have been lethal in any age. Herod's flesh became an unholy testament to the frailty of power, a macabre warning that no earthly throne could stave off the final triumph of decay. And so, wrapped in layers of linen, soaked in antiseptics, and placed upon a gilded couch, Herod faced each morning not with hope, but with grim acceptance. He had built palaces, harbours, and temples to defy oblivion. Yet now that he lay at the mercy of his own rotting flesh, all his monuments felt as hollow as the chambers of his infected body. Night after night, his breath grew shallower, his pulse weaker, and the lines on his forehead deeper. In that palace of stone and shadow, the greatest king Judea had ever known became a living ruin, undone by a disease that recognized no rank, no heritage, and no decree. Recently, the necrotic tissue in Herod's groin region had deteriorated so severely that flies swarmed in dense clouds around his bedchamber. These insects laid their eggs directly into the festering wounds, which Josephus vividly recorded would hatch into maggots feeding on live flesh. He wrote, "These horrible creatures crawled across his skin, producing an itch as if 10,000 fine needles were piercing him," a description that still raises the hairs on the back of one's neck. Without antibiotics, which would not be discovered for nearly 18 centuries, and lacking the radical debridement techniques of modern surgery, the maggots proliferated without restraint. The royal physicians, once confident in their Hippocratic training, resorted to the crude method of manually extracting each larva with small probes. They used slender bronze rods tipped with hooks and fine cheeses, attempting to coax the maggots from deep within the rotting tissue. Yet no sooner had they removed one batch than replacements appeared, hatched from newly deposited eggs. Each attempt to extract them was excruciating. The maggots burrowed into the decayed flesh, and when a physician attempted to pull one out, the surrounding live tissue often tore away, causing profuse bleeding. Herod lay motionless through these procedures, his powerful frame reduced to stillness, his characteristic stoicism a thin veneer over unbearable suffering. He endeavoured to stifle his groans, offering only a barely audible exhale, with each tug at a maggot embedded near the margin of decay. The odour was putrid, a mixture of fermenting proteins and the sweet, sickly scent of decay that no perfumed incense could completely mask. Attendants dared not linger. They rotated shifts every few minutes, only staying just long enough to steady the king's robes and assist him in breathing. For a man who had once commanded legions and shaped the destiny of a kingdom, this was the ultimate degradation. He could no longer sit in the ornate chairs of his throne room, nor lie supine on the cushioned divans of his private suite. Instead, he lay curled in a fetal position on his bed, as though to hide the corruption from sight, or at least to shrink his body enough that fewer maggots might find purchase. Night after night, the writhing of these larvae beneath his skin robbed him of any chance of rest. He would awake at odd hours, eyes flickering open to the sound of scratching an internal trellis of movement that made him start in terror. When he dared to move slightly, the maggots were disturbed and crawled toward the fresh fissures in his flesh, intensifying his agony. Sleep became a distant memory. He drifted in and out of fevered dreams only to awaken in greater distress. Even the pagans who visited the healing waters of Calais refused to approach when they heard that they risked stepping into a chamber clouded with the stench of living death. Rumors of Herod's fate spread through the small towns around Jericho. Traders, travelers, and even the occasional caravan of pilgrims spoke in hushed tones of the king eaten alive. No one dared to remark it in his presence, of course, but the hushed laughter and veiled pity followed him like a shadow. His servants, once the humblest of vassals, now bore witness to something never imagined. Their sovereign, whose decrees had carried the weight of law and empire, was powerless against creatures no larger than a grain of barley. They took turns washing his wounds with vinegar diluted in cold water, a mixture thought to discourage the larvae, yet they could not stop them. The vinegar stung the raw flesh, causing us all to cringe at the sound of his low moan. One by one, attendants resigned, unwilling to face the horror anew each day. Only a handful remained, stoically fulfilling their duty. Throughout this ordeal, Herod's mind remained as sharp as ever, though tortured by the nightly invasions. He would direct his scribes to update his testament yet again, shifting inheritances between his sons, trying to forestall betrayal even as he lay at death's door. His sharp political instinct did not abate. Each howl of pain was followed by orders on grain shipments, tax relief for drought, stricken villages, and instructions for new fortifications along the Jordan frontier. And yet, beneath every directive lay a profound defeat. He had sought to immortalize himself in stone and coin, to be remembered for millennia as a builder and benefactor. Instead, he was being remembered for the living nightmare of his final days. A man consumed by his own flesh, devoured by vermin that reduced him to a twisting form of flesh and bone. The palace physicians, now shattered in spirit, admitted among themselves that they could no longer distinguish where the dead tissue ended and the living began. As the infestation spread beyond his groin into small ulcers near his lower abdomen and the base of his spine, Herod's movements became so agonizing that he feared a shift might dislodge a mass of larvae within him, leading to catastrophic bleeding. Even the simplest act of raising his hand to sign a decree was accompanied by a tremor of dread. Would more maggots be exposed? Thus, each day was marked by the same ritual. The physicians approached at dawn, instruments in hand. Herod trembled as they parted the decayed flesh to expose fresh wounds. The maggots writhed and were extracted. The wounds were cleansed. Then they departed, leaving him alone in a haze of pain and sedation. He had become a living testament to human frailty, an unwilling host to an army of parasites. The grandeur of his reign lay in ruins, and all that remained was the relentless, wriggling horror of his own decaying body. After the terrifying onslaught of gangrene and maggot infestation, Herod's body began to manifest signs of pulmonary edema and respiratory failure. Fluid accumulated in his lungs, filling the air sacs to the point that every breath became a struggle. He wheezed audibly with each inhalation, his chest heaving as if weighed down by lead. Occasionally he would cough up streaks of bright red blood, a brutal confirmation that the capillaries in his lungs were now so overwhelmed that they were bursting under pressure. His skin took on a jaundiced yellow pallor, while his fingertips and lips turned a ghastly shade of blue from lack of oxygen. The royal physicians, who had never before witnessed such severe pulmonary edema, noted with alarm that the fluid would sometimes spurt from his mouth in tiny jets with each tortured gasp. Simultaneous with his respiratory decline, Herod's digestive system collapsed into catastrophic failure. He suffered from bloody diarrhea so violent that each visit to the chamber pot sent waves of agony through his abdominal cavity. The mucous membranes of his intestines were so damaged that they leaked both blood and serous fluid, further depleting his body of vital fluids and electrolytes. As the gangrenous wounds continued to discharge pus and serum, he was losing blood at an alarming rate. This combination of hemorrhagic diarrhea and weeping ulcers left him perpetually lightheaded and dizzy. Once a man who strode confidently through his palace halls, he now lay prostrate in his bed, every inch of his body racked by pain, a living cadaver incapable of escape or relief. Mentally, Herod floated in and out of lucidity. Some hours, he would weep softly as he gazed upon the festering lesions at his groin, tears mingling with sweat upon his cracked lips. In other moments, his mind would sharpen with political thought, and he would summon scribes to draft yet another version of his testament. The courtiers, summoned in drips and drabs, never knew which iteration to obey. Once sworn to one clause, they would be told the next day that the clause had been revoked. This torrent of changing wills ignited an undercurrent of factional intrigue. a silent battle of influence waged within the walls of his death chamber. Many feared to volunteer their loyalty, and only a handful of staunch retainers remained, pledging to see to Herod's final rites and ensure that his decrees would be carried out beyond the grave. By the end of this harrowing phase, Herod had lost all capacity to govern effectively. The scales of power that he once balanced so deftly in his mind lay shattered. He understood, even in his most lucid moments, that his political legacy was crumbling before his eyes. His children seethed with anger over the ever-shifting terms of succession. The Jewish population, long resentful of his rule by fear, now glared at him with open contempt. Meanwhile, the Romans watched with calculated patience, awaiting any pretext to intervene directly. A king who had once dreamed of immortalizing himself through monumental works, temples, fortresses, harbours, now teetered on the edge of oblivion, with no clear heir to steady the throne after his passing. It was in these final days that the delicate tripod of power, Herod himself, his heirs, and Roman favour began to collapse. The intricate web of alliances he had spun unravelled thread by thread. His son Archelaus, emboldened by one version of the testament, began assembling supporters. Antipas, furious at being passed over in another draft, withdrew to Galilee. Philip, sensing the shifting tides, reached out to provincial governors in Syria. The vacuum left by Herod's incapacitation threatened to plunge the realm into civil strife, and the once-ordained unity of his kingdom fractured into competing fiefs. Indeed, the post-Herod era would be defined by division and decline. Following his death, Augustus Caesar would receive multiple delegations from rival claimants, each pressing their case in the imperial court. Ultimately, in 6 of the Common Era, the governor of Rome would depose Archelaus, restructure Judea into a Roman province, and consign Herod's dynasty to history. But as Herod lay on his deathbed, none of this was yet certain, only the grim awareness that his grand ambitions had failed to produce a lasting inheritance. Thus, in the cold gloom of his bedchamber, the once mighty builder of wonders lay humbled by disease and mortality. Each ragged breath, each spasm of agony, each tearful command left behind the unmistakable truth. Power can erect the loftiest monuments, but it cannot stave off decay. And so, as he stared into the flickering candlelight, Herod the Great confronted the ultimate reality that no empire, no family pact, no architectural marvel could prevent the final collapse of flesh and empire alike. When his illness surged to its horrific zenith, Herod descended into a realm of paranoia so absolute that he believed his own eldest son, Antipater, was plotting to assassinate him and claim the throne. This conviction had no firm evidence, only rumours whispered among the palace staff. But to Herod's fevered mind, the threat was as real as any army. He issued an immediate arrest warrant for Antipater, ordering his son to be imprisoned and ready for execution at dawn, and notably did not seek the approval of the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. Such unilateral action mirrored the tragic events of 26 before the Common Era, when he had executed his beloved wife Mariamne and 2 elder sons on suspicion of betrayal. In his growing desperation, Herod summoned the noblemen of Judea to assemble in Jericho under the pretense of official business, only to inform them that if none stepped forward to mourn him in genuine sorrow upon his death, they would all be executed as hostages. This merciless plan, ordering the deaths of respected figures simply to secure sacks of tears, demonstrated the final extremity of a man unhinged by fear. He believed that by forcing public displays of grief, he could salvage his legacy, ensuring that the populace would not rejoice at his passing. Even as his mind teetered on the brink of madness, Herod retained enough lucidity to dictate administrative edicts and revise his testament. The palace descended into chaos. Courtiers arrived with trembling deference, only to be sent away with conflicting instructions on tax relief, grain allocations, and military postings. One morning, a decree named Archelaus principal heir. By evening, a fresh draft favoured Antipas. Before midnight, Philip was written in as the sole successor. Each iteration demanded immediate acknowledgement, leaving ministers too terrified to commit any decision to paper. The constant revisions ignited a silent civil war within the bedchamber, as factions formed around each potential heir, vying for the king's fleeting favour. Herod's profound isolation deepened his suffering. No family member dared to stay at his side for more than a few minutes, repelled by the stench of decay and the memory of his past cruelties. Those who visited out of duty found little comfort in his presence. Instead, his chamber echoed only with the hiss of his laboured breathing and the distant drip of exudate from his festering wounds. The mighty king, once surrounded by scores of advisors and servants, now lay abandoned, save for a handful of unwilling attendants who kept watch out of obligation rather than affection. For a father who had sired dozens of children, historical accounts reference at least 14 sons and several daughters. This profound loneliness was his severest punishment. He who had commanded armies and ruled through fear now faced the cold truth that neither conquest nor terror could secure genuine loyalty. His heart, so accustomed to issuing death warrants, now ached for a comfort he had long denied others. Each night, as he drifted between fevered confusion and bursts of clarity, he would sometimes murmur Antipater's name, remembering the son he had betrayed, or catch a glimpse of himself in a polished copper basin and recoil from the sight of a corpse still clinging to life. His mind raced with the irony that his own edict's decrees to execute innocent hostages, to revise the line of succession at whim, had erected barriers to the very solace he now craved. The court, too, felt the tremors of this collapse. Senior officials who once held secure positions found themselves under suspicion. A general dismissed for insufficient zeal, a treasurer accused of embezzlement. Those who had been Herod's staunchest allies now whispered that his final days were consumed by the same paranoia that had shattered his family decades earlier. In candlelit corridors, they wondered how quickly the kingdom would fracture once he passed from this world. Despite his delirium, Herod clung to the ritual of rulership. He demanded to review reports on construction at Caesarea Maritima, to approve tax codes for Idumea, to receive updates on the grain fleets bound for Galilee. Each request was a fragile assertion that his power remained intact, even as his body deteriorated and his mind unravelled. He required petitioners to address him as Your Majesty, though the title tasted of ash in his mouth. It was within this maelstrom of delusion and authority that Herod's final political acts were conceived. He marshalled his remaining strength to issue one last comprehensive will, an 18-page document delineating the division of territory among his sons and the guardianship of his daughters. He insisted on sealing it with his signet ring, the pressed image of an eagle clutching a laurel wreath serving as a reminder of the impermanence of power. In the stillness between his laboured breaths, the king reflected on Versailles, turned to ruins within his own body. He had sought to secure eternity through temples and fortresses, yet found himself undone by an empire of doubt he had cultivated within his own mind. As the hours stretched on, the finality of his solitude pressed upon him. The realization that, in the end, power could not compel love, loyalty, or even genuine sorrow. And in that bleak moment, Herod the Great confronted the ultimate void, the silence that follows the fall of every tyrant's crown. Herod's last hope lay in the famed healing springs of Callo, located approximately 18 miles east of Jericho on the shores of the Dead Sea. For generations, travelers had sung praises of these sulfur-rich waters, believing that immersion could cure everything from rheumatism to gangrene. In the spring of 4, before the Common Era, the king, desperate and near the brink of collapse, ordered a final expedition to carry him to those steaming pools. The journey itself was an ordeal. Herod could not sit astride a horse, nor even recline comfortably on the litter. 4 strong bearers draped in linen carried him inch by agonizing inch over rocky trails scarred by flash floods. Each jolt of the litter caused fresh waves of pain to ripple through the necrotic tissue at his groin, and ofttimes he gasped, clutching at his side. The stench of decaying flesh, mixed with the sweat of the exhausted porters, filled the narrow gorge. Onlookers, local Bedouin guides, and a handful of Roman auxiliaries kept their distance, many retching at the odour. Upon arrival at the Callo Springs, attendants constructed a makeshift bath of smooth stones, funneling the hot water into a circular basin. The water issued from a fracture in the earth at a temperature measured later by engineers at approximately 95 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying dissolved minerals of sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. Herod was lifted by oiled arms and gently placed into the steaming pool. For a fleeting moment, relief seemed possible as the water enveloped his battered flesh. Then came the shock. The intense heat caused blisters to erupt on the margins of the gangrenous flesh. Small patches of tissue detached, releasing rancid fluid into the bath. Herod's body convulsed violently, arms flailing. He gasped once, twice, and then slipped into unconsciousness. His attendants, believing him dead, lifted him from the pool and laid him on the rocky shore. His skin, already stretched taut from swelling, went pale. They fanned his face, poured cool water over him, and dashed aromatic oils beneath his nostrils. Miraculously, after several minutes, he drew a ragged breath and murmured. The attendants sighed in relief, though none dared speak above a whisper. This catastrophic episode at Calais shattered Herod's confidence in all traditional remedies. The miracle waters he had believed could cleanse his corruption only intensified his agony. No longer would he entertain hopes of recovery. Instead, he embraced the certainty of his impending demise. Within days of that fateful immersion, he summoned his scribes for what he declared to be his final testament. In that last will, sealed in scarlet wax, he apportioned his realm thus: Idumea and Jerusalem to his son Archelaus, Galilee and Perea to Antipas, Iturea and Trachonitis to Philip. These divisions reflected both historic administrative regions and his shifting affections. Yet as soon as the document was sealed, Herod's rage reignited. He ordered that any seeds of rebellion among the assembled Jewish elite in Jericho be executed upon his death, irrespective of innocence or rank. His words, slurred but unmistakable, conveyed a final act of terror. If the people would not grieve genuinely, they would weep over their own dead. This bloodthirsty command marked the zenith of his desperation and paranoia. Rather than die quietly in the presence of family, if any still dared remain, Herod chose to sow fear to the very last breath. The priests of Jerusalem, aghast at the prospect of mass slaughter, petitioned Augustus for clemency, but Herod's fate was sealed. In his fevered mind, this cruelty was an assertion of enduring sovereignty, even as his body failed him utterly. The tragedy of Calais lay not only in the physical torment, but in the symbolic collapse of hope. Had the springs healed him, he might have found the strength to reconcile with his heirs, to mend the torn fabric of his dynasty. Instead, the hottest waters on earth only fanned the flames of his paranoia, fueling the cruelest decisions of his final days. His courtiers, half dead with fear and exhaustion, dared not protest. They executed his orders with mechanical precision, their hearts as brittle as the drying mud of Calais' shoreline. By the close of this episode, Herod's kingdom teetered on the edge of ruin. The sons he had so capriciously favoured recoiled at the shadow of their father's wrath. Commoners, long oppressed by heavy taxation, looked on in horror at the thought of hostages marched to execution. Roman governors exchanged grim letters with the emperor in faraway Rome, debating whether to intervene preemptively. All the while, Herod lay back on his pallet, his chest rising and falling in shallow, tortured breaths, a titan brought low by the very power he had once wielded without mercy. Thus, the springs of Calais, once hailed as nature's remedy, became the stage for Herod's ultimate catastrophe. In his quest to conquer death through immersion in mineral waters, he instead baptized himself in despair. The failure of that last hope cast a long shadow over the final chapter of his life, underscoring the cruel paradox that, in the end, no well, no matter how holy, could quench the sickness that consumed him from within. After the necrosis of his groin region reached its most severe stage, the putrefying flesh became an irresistible magnet for flies. They swarmed around Herod's bedchamber in dense clouds, their buzzing filling the air with a sickening drone. The insects laid their eggs directly into the festering wounds, which hatched into legions of maggot scolices, as Josephus grimly described them, craving the rotting tissue. These larvae burrowed deep beneath the surface, their bodies expanding with each feeding, only to molt and emerge even larger, an endless cycle of decay. Night after night, Herod found no refuge in sleep. The maggots wriggled ceaselessly, their movements like 1,000 tiny needles probing his flesh. He tossed and turned, his body never still, desperate to stifle the urge to scream. Around midnight, when the air turned still and the candles guttered, he clutched the bedsheets in white-knuckled agony, fighting to maintain a dignified silence so as not to alarm the throng of courtiers and physicians pressed outside his door. Each time a maggot was dislodged by his flinching, it revealed new pockets of decay, and the odour of fermenting flesh intensified. The royal physicians, once proud of their Hippocratic lineage, attempted every known remedy to halt the surge of larvae. They soaked cloths in wine and sprinkled them with aromatic oils, believing that the alcohol and fragrance might repel the flies. They smeared the wounds with mixtures of myrrh and rose oil, hoping the strong scent would deter egg-laying. Yet despite these efforts, the maggots only multiplied. Every treatment seemed to create a more inviting environment, moist and warm, perfect for further infestation. When a physician dared to delve into the deepest recesses of the wound to extract the maggots with fine probes, the process was excruciating. The larvae clung to sinew and tendon. Pulling them free often tore live tissue, triggering a fresh cascade of bleeding. The prince's attendants had to hold him down, wrapping his legs in leather straps lest his thrashing limbs knock over the lamp. Each extraction session lasted what felt like an eternity, punctuated by the soft, wet sounds of larvae being removed and the king's laboured breaths. Herod lay motionless once the ordeal concluded, his body limp, beads of sweat tracing lines down his gaunt cheeks. He would whisper a prayer, begging for an end to the torment, though he had long since ceased to believe in divine mercy. His eyes remained half-closed, pupils fluttering as if chasing a distant, unreachable respite. His court, that once humming court of ambition and intrigue, now moved like a funeral procession. Servants, repulsed by the stench, wore masks soaked in aromatic vinegar. Fewer than a dozen attendants rotated through the chamber each hour, ensuring that the king's wounds were cleaned and redressed, though none could bear the task for more than a few minutes. Outside, the streets of Jerusalem echoed with another sound, barely contained jubilation. Word of Herod's condition had spread among the populace. Shopkeepers lowered their shutters in excitement, neighbours exchanged triumphant glances, and crowds gathered in the marketplaces to whisper, "The tyrant is rotting alive." This outpouring of communal schadenfreude stung more than any physical wound. Herod, who had once ruled with a mixture of fear and jealously guarded respect, now heard only the cheers of his people, exultant at his suffering. Within the palace, the atmosphere was equally dire. These handful of steadfast attendants moved like zombies in hushed coordination. They spoke in muffled tones, only to preserve traces of duty rather than compassion. Each knew the moment they crossed the threshold into Herod's chamber might be their last shift. They might never find the courage or the constitution to return. They braced themselves for the assault of the stench, inhaled through tightly held scarves, and forced themselves to focus on the mechanical motions. Clean the wound, remove the larvae, apply salve, bandage the area. Herod, in the grip of delirium, scarcely recognized reality. He stared at the ceiling, seeing patterns of bugs crawling across the frescoes in his mind, as if the infestation had seeped into every surface. Once, he tried to speak a command to summon a scribe, only to gasp as a maggot surfaced near his navel, then murmur, "Not now," before falling silent once more. In those final days, every moment was measured by the arrival of the royal physician's chamber pot, or the grind of a probe against infected flesh. Each dawn brought fresh swarms of flies, each dusk thicker clouds of larvae. The king's mind, once so sharp, drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes recalling the grand temples he had built to immortalize his name, sometimes conjuring the faces of those he had executed in his earlier purges. Ultimately, Herod's body became a grotesque monument to the limits of power. No wall, no coin, no palace could shield him from the ravages of gangrene and maggots. Night after night he endured a living hell, curled in fettered stillness, a fallen giant reduced to a vessel for decay. And so, in the quiet, suffocating gloom of his death chamber, the once great builder of monuments faced the final, unrelenting horror of his own flesh turning against him, a reminder that even a king is nothing before the inexorable march of death and rot. When the maggots finally overran every inch of the gangrenous wounds, Herod's body teetered on the brink of unconsciousness. He drifted in and out of awareness, at times slipping into brief periods of stupor in which he did not respond to the frantic inquiries of his physicians or the hushed whispers of his attendants. In those moments his breathing would slow, his pulse would falter, and the court would hold its collective breath. Then, as if pulled back from the abyss, he would reawaken, his eyes fluttering open to ask in a hoarse whisper about the state of his testament whether Archelaus had accepted the inheritance of Idumea, whether Antipas would abide by the division of Galilee, and whether Philip stood ready to govern Iturea. The royal physicians, gaunt and exhausted, could offer no comfort. They reported only that his condition was beyond all hope of cure, that the final hour might arrive at any moment. Herod's body convulsed in violent spasms, his limbs jerking in rhythms that resembled epilepsy more than any known disease. Each fit would contort his face into agony, eyes tightly shut even as beads of sweat formed on his brow. Between convulsions, he would lie still, chest heaving, as though gathering the strength for the next spasm. Yet within these fluctuations of consciousness, he summoned enough lucidity to give final commands. A scribe was brought forward with trembling hands to write his last will. Archelaus was named the primary heir to the royal palace at Jerusalem and the territories of Idumea and Judea. Antipas was assigned the rule over Galilee and Perea. Philip was granted the eastern provinces of Iturea and Trachonitis. Each clause was pronounced slowly, each name repeated as if Herod feared the ink might dry before his wishes were fully recorded. As soon as the document was sealed with scarlet wax bearing his signet ring, an eagle clutching a laurel wreath, it ignited immediate discord. A faction of courtiers, loyal to Archelaus, claimed that the will's language was clear and binding. Another faction, backing Antipas, produced a hastily scribbled addendum that purported to shift control of Perea. Philip's supporters argued that Iturea, newly mined for copper, should yield even greater revenues, and they hinted at appealing directly to Rome for confirmation. In the palace corridors, this gave rise to a muffled struggle for influence, as aides of each prince hurried to secure alliances. The basement chambers that once stored grain now held whispered conclaves. The ornate reception hall became an accidental tribunal of competing claims. Finally, after weeks of unbearable torment, Herod drew his last breath in the early hours of the 29th day of March, in the year 4 before the Common Era. The chamber fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the oil lamps. No trumpets sounded a lament, no musicians struck up a funeral dirge. Instead, the courtiers, pale, haggard, and unaccustomed to genuine sorrow, exhaled in relief. They closed the linen-wrapped body and stepped back, uncertainty already shadowing their faces as they contemplated the fragile future of the divided kingdom. Within hours, the news spread through Jericho and Jerusalem alike. The stones seemed to quake under the impact of the announcement. The king is dead. In the streets there was neither the joyous celebration of an oppressor's passing nor the respectful mourning befitting a sovereign. Instead, merchants packed up their stalls, supporters of different heirs paraded their banners, and the city braced for the unrest that always follows a power vacuum. Roman procurators stationed in the region readied messengers to carry the dispatches to Augustus, seeking guidance on which claimant to favor. Herod's death marked the end of an era of grand construction and ruthless rule. His vast building programs, expansions of the Second Temple platform, the coastal port of Caesarea Maritima, the fortress palace of Masada, stood as silent witnesses to both his ambition and his cruelty. Now, those monuments loomed as empty testaments to a fractured legacy. The carefully engineered balance he had maintained between Roman authorities and Jewish elites disintegrated within days. Tax collectors who had once relayed the king's precise levies now found themselves uncertain which son's decree to enforce. Generals of his armies, having served under one command for decades, faltered over whom to swear allegiance to. Even as Herod's remains were prepared for the funeral procession, a lavish ritual he had ordered to span from Jericho to his personal tomb atop the Herodium tensions ran high. The body, swathed in layers of linen steeped in aromatic spices, had to be carried in a golden bier borne by weary soldiers. Behind it, the three princes rode in a tense cavalcade, each guarded by detachments worried about an assassination attempt. Local populations lined the route, but their faces revealed more anxiety than reverence. By the time the funeral cortege reached the Herodium Hill 12 miles from Jerusalem, the division of loyalties was unmistakable. Some cheered for Archelaus, others clapped for Antipas, and still more held back, waiting to see which heir would secure Rome's backing. The rock-cut tomb, intended as a symbol of the king's eternal glory, felt ironically hollow. Herod had built it to dominate the skyline, but in death it only underscored the emptiness of his achievements in the face of human mortality and political fragmentation. Thus ended the life of Herod the Great, a ruler renowned for his architectural marvels and infamous for his paranoia and brutality. His final days, marked by illness, madness, and shifting allegiances, transformed into the prologue of a doomed dynasty. Under Roman supervision, The territories would be carved into separate tetrarchies, and eventually the memory of his reign would fade, leaving only the ruins of his grandest projects as testament to both his greatness and his downfall. When Herod the Great finally drew his last, shallow breath in the early hours of 4 before the Common Era, the court sprang into action to prepare his funeral in accordance with Jewish tradition. Within the palace walls, a team of embalmers worked feverishly to preserve his ravaged corpse. They employed countless mixtures of aromatic spices, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and poured rivers of scented oils over the decaying tissue. Yet, no matter how many trays of resins, how many pounds of incense they burned, the stench of rot proved almost impossible to mask. Layers of thick linen were wrapped tightly around the body in hopes of containing the fragments of flesh that now sloughed away at the slightest touch. The funeral procession that followed was as grand as any in Judea's history. A detachment of soldiers clad in gleaming armor from the royal guard carried a golden bier beneath a canopy of purple silk. Musicians clad in robes of black wool marched ahead, their haunting notes of the kinnor and lyre echoing against the stone walls of the palace courtyard. Behind the bier walked a cohort of professional mourners, women trained in the arts of lamentation, whose ululations rose and fell with ancient ritual precision. Despite the splendor of the ceremony, the crowds lining the streets of Jerusalem did not weep. Instead, many whispered triumphant curses, even letting slip small smiles. These were the people who had endured heavy taxation and harsh decrees under Herod's rule. To them, his death was a liberation, not a tragedy. The path from Jerusalem to Herodium spanned approximately 12 kilometers of rugged hill country. Under a pale dawn sky, the litter bearing Herod's remains jolted and shook over rocky terrain. At one point, a section of the linen wrappings loosened, revealing blackened patches of skin and decaying flesh. A wave of nausea rippled through the mourners. Attendants paused to adjust their cloth masks soaked in rosewater, while priests murmured prayers for the departed king's soul. Even the camels and donkeys that accompanied the procession balked at the odor, their handlers forcing them onward with firm tugs on the reins. At Herodium itself, the hilltop fortress palace that Herod had commissioned to serve as both royal retreat and mausoleum, the mourners laid verdant branches across the gatehouse entrance before carrying the bier up the stone ramparts. Once at the summit, a scarlet cloth was unfurled onto an altar-like platform of pale limestone. The bier was set down, and the tomb beneath awaited its occupant. Stonecutters had already inscribed over the entrance in Aramaic and Latin, "Here lies Herod the Great, King of Judea." The tomb's design echoed a fortress, complete with staircases leading to a central chamber, symbolizing an eternal watch over the land he had once commanded. Yet that day, as the bier descended into the dark recesses of the sepulchre, the grandeur of Herod's final resting place seemed hollow. The silent stone, once polished and imposing, now awaited a body ravaged by disease rather than honored in death. In the years that followed, the tomb suffered further indignities. During the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 Common Era, rebels breached the chamber and scattered the remains. Later centuries saw stones pilfered for new construction, until the monument lay forgotten, its memory as shattered as the king's tortured body. With the burial rites complete, the court found no comfort in ritual. The moment the tomb was sealed, an uneasy silence settled over the palace. Privy councillors exchanged anxious glances. Herod's final will had split the kingdom among his 3 sons. Archelaus to govern Judea and Idumea, Antipas to rule Galilee and Perea, and Philip to oversee Iturea and Trachonitis. But the document, drawn up in the king's final delirium, lacked the unity that might have held the realm together. Factions formed instantly, each claimant marshalling supporters in the shadows of Herodium's stone walls. Within a year, Augustus Caesar himself intervened. The emperor summoned delegates from each faction to Rome to argue their case. In the spring of 6 Common Era, Augustus issued his ruling. Archelaus was deposed, and Judea became a Roman province under direct rule of a procurator. Antipas remained tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, while Philip retained his small northeastern territories. Thus, the unified kingdom Herod had carved out over nearly 40 years disintegrated within 2 decades of his death. Today, the ruins of Herodium stand as a silent monument to the futility of earthly ambition. Once the centerpiece of a grand funeral, those same chambers now lie in crumbling disrepair. The aqueducts he built to supply the fortress have long since collapsed, and the ornate inscriptions have faded under centuries of sun and wind. Archaeologists who uncover shards of red-tinged fresco and broken columns pause to reflect on the irony. A king who sought to immortalize himself through stone and ceremony was instead remembered for his final, fractured legacy. In that twilight between power and oblivion, Herod the Great's funeral ceremony revealed the paradox at the heart of his reign. He had amassed wealth and erected wonders to transcend mortality, yet in the end, his body succumbed to rot and rejection. The pomp and ritual that accompanied his burial masked only a deeper truth. Legacy is a fragile thing, easily undone by human frailty and the inexorable march of time. In the solemn hush of Herodium's ruins, one confronts not the triumphant immortal, but the haunted memory of a man undone by his own impermanence. Herod's death marked the end of a relatively stable period in Judea that had lasted for nearly 4 decades. Upon his passing in 4 before the Common Era, his 3 sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, were formally designated to inherit and rule different portions of the kingdom. Archelaus, as the eldest surviving son, was to receive the largest share, including Jerusalem and Idumea, while Antipas was granted Galilee and Perea, and Philip was assigned the more remote eastern territories of Iturea and Trachonitis. However, stability evaporated almost immediately. Archelaus faced fierce opposition from the Judean populace, who harbored deep resentment against the Herodian dynasty for its heavy taxation and ruthless suppression of dissent. Within weeks of his accession, protests and petitions flooded the palace, accusing Archelaus of cruelty and greed. His grip on power felt tenuous. Even the priests at the Temple of Jerusalem exchanged clandestine complots questioning his legitimacy. Thus began the unraveling of Herod's carefully constructed political order. In response to the escalating unrest, Emperor Augustus summoned representatives of Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip to Rome for adjudication. The hearing extended over many months, as each claimant marshaled witnesses and documents to support his case before the imperial court. Finally, in the year 6 of the Common Era, Augustus issued his decree. Archelaus was stripped of his title and exiled to Vienne in Gaul. Judea was converted into a Roman province under the administration of a procurator, thus subjecting it to direct Roman governance. Antipas was restored as Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, retaining a measure of autonomy, while Philip continued to govern his allocated northeastern district. This partition was intended to prevent any single ruler from amassing enough influence to challenge Roman authority. Yet the reconfiguration failed to secure lasting peace. In the decade that followed, a series of sporadic uprisings erupted across Judea. These insurrections sprang from residual Herodian loyalists and patriotic Jews who felt betrayed by both Herod's line and the new Roman regime. Unrest was particularly acute in Galilee, where Antipas's rule, though lighter in taxes, was still seen as complicit with Rome. Over time, these small rebellions coalesced into a broader resistance movement. Out of this ferment emerged the Zealots, a militant faction committed to expelling Roman rule entirely. Their activities laid the groundwork for the Great Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 73 of the Common Era, which would bring even more devastation to the land. Culturally, Herod's reign left an indelible mark on Judea's architectural and infrastructural landscape. He had overseen the monumental expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, constructing a vast plaza and colonnades that dwarfed its modest predecessor. His engineers built the port of Caesarea Maritima, pioneering the use of underwater hydraulic concrete, and carved elaborate aqueducts and roadways throughout the region. Masada, perched atop a desert plateau, served as both a winter palace and an impregnable fortress. Yet under direct Roman rule, many of these projects were either modified for imperial needs or fell into neglect. Earthquakes, looting, and systematic dismantling during periods of revolt reduced once grand edifices to fragments. Today, visitors to Herodium or Caesarea see ruins that echo the scale of Herod's ambitions, but also testify to the transience of imperial grandeur. In the collective memory of Judea, Herod's grotesque death, rendered in vivid detail by historians, became a moral parable. Parents recounted to children how even the mightiest tyrant could not escape the consuming rot of his own ambition. Songs and folk tales portrayed Herod as a cautionary figure, a ruler who ruled by fear and perished by disease. This folklore underscored a universal truth that power, when abused, invites its own reckoning. Politically, the collapse of the Herodian dynasty created a vacuum that empowered the Jewish priestly and sectarian orders. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes each vied for influence over a population uncertain about its leadership and spiritual direction. The Pharisees advocated strict adherence to oral law and popular interpretation of Scripture. The Sadducees upheld the written Torah and temple rites. The Essenes retreated to communal life by the Dead Sea, awaiting divine intervention. This fragmentation of religious authority fueled ideological debates, legal disputes, and at times violent confrontations within Jewish society. This atmosphere of religious and political turmoil provided fertile ground for the emergence of new spiritual movements. Although outside the strict scope of Judean internal affairs, the early 1st century Common Era saw the beginnings of Christianity, which would draw on Jewish apocalyptic expectations. In neighboring regions, Buddhism had already spread along trade routes from India into the Middle East, and later, Gnostic sects would flourish in the same cultural crossroads. The mosaic of competing beliefs, born from Herod's architectural legacy, and the political disintegration that followed, shaped the religious transformations that defined the broader Mediterranean world in subsequent centuries. Thus, the death of Herod the Great inaugurated a period of upheaval that rippled across Judea and beyond. His three-way partition of power, intended to preserve continuity, instead fractured the kingdom and paved the way for direct Roman rule. Cultural achievements, temples, ports, and fortresses became battlegrounds of rebellion or relics for archaeologists. And the vacuum left by his dynasty's fall fueled religious ferment, setting the stage for the profound spiritual shifts of late antiquity. In the end, Herod's legacy proved as unstable as the ground beneath the great structures he left behind. Even though the Herodian dynasty collapsed in the turmoil that followed Herod's death, his architectural legacy continues to exert an unmistakable presence on the landscape of ancient Judea. The Second Temple in Jerusalem, originally a modest structure, was transformed under Herod's directive into a monumental complex that dwarfed its predecessor. Its outer court spanned approximately 230 meters on each side, paved with gleaming white stones quarried from the hills of Judea. A vast colonnade, each column carved from single blocks of limestone, encircled the Temple Mount, providing covered walkways for pilgrims and scribes alike. At the center, a grand staircase led worshippers to the upper platform, where the Holy of Holies once stood, now enclosed within an even more imposing set of walls and gates. Southwest of the temple lay Herod's most daring engineering feat, the port of Caesarea Maritima. Here, he had commissioned the construction of a breakwater using a then revolutionary form of hydraulic concrete that set under water. Large stone blocks, faced with tiles bearing intricate Roman-style mosaics, formed the quays where grain ships from Alexandria and Rome would dock. Nearby, reservoirs and cisterns collected rainwater, feeding aqueducts that supplied the town atop a cliff. The harbour's foundations, tested by centuries of storms, have revealed the durability of Herod's techniques. Archaeologists today still dive to study the preserved underwater concrete structures. Far to the south, perched precariously on a desert escarpment, stands the fortress of Masada. Herod converted this natural plateau into an impregnable palace. Fortress, complete with barracks, storerooms, and bathhouses fed by aqueducts. In the conflict of 66 to 73 Common Era, Jewish rebels made their last stand here, turning Herod's winter villa into a fortress of defiance. Archaeological remains of Roman siege ramps attest to both Herod's ambitious plans and the subsequent military dramas that unfolded upon his death. Yet among these enduring monuments, Herodium Herod's own funerary estate once housed the king's sarcophagus in a tomb renowned for its grandeur. Little remained of this mausoleum after the Jewish revolt of 66 Common Era, during which zealots and Roman legions wrought destruction. It was not until the excavation led by archaeologist Ehud Netzer in 2007 Common Era that the mausoleum's near-intact stone vault was rediscovered. Netzer's team uncovered a series of interconnected burial chambers, their walls decorated with relief carvings of garlands and eagles. The marble sarcophagus lid, still bearing a carved laurel wreath, testified to Herod's pursuit of eternal glory and his desire to be remembered as a ruler of unmatched status. However, the tomb's discovery raised as many questions as it answered. No human remains that could be definitively attributed to Herod have been identified. Centuries of desecration likely scattered or destroyed his bones. The few bone fragments found within the chambers were too fragmentary and commingled with remains of other interments to allow confident identification. Thus, the gruesome details of his rotting flesh recorded by Josephus for their moral and sensational power remain a matter of text rather than physical evidence. Nevertheless, Herodium stands today as a testament to Herod's drive to defy time. The terraces he cut into the slope, the colonnaded porticos, the hidden cisterns all embody his ambition to assert an unending presence on the hills of Judea. Yet, the same silence that surrounds his missing remains underscores the ultimate futility of such endeavors. War, rebellion, and the slow decay of memory have buried the physical traces of his body, while stone and mortar endure only as fragments of an extraordinary but doomed quest for permanence. In the villages below, local storytellers still recite fragments of the final days of the great builder king. They speak of worms devouring his flesh while his heart still beat, of maggots feasting where marble once gleamed. These tales, passed from one generation to the next, ensure that Herod's name retains a curious double legacy, one of architectural marvels that shaped the region for centuries, and another of a body consumed by its own decay. In this uneasy juxtaposition, we find a lesson that resonates even today. The most impressive monuments may outlast their creators, but no walls of stone, no harbour, no fortress, however grand, can forestall the inexorable passage of time and the final triumph of nature's reclaiming hand. The agonizing death of Herod the Great is often viewed as a form of poetic justice, a fitting punishment for a ruler whose reign was marked by tyranny and mass murder. The first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus did more than chronicle medical symptoms. He underscored a moral lesson. Here was a man who had slain his own sons and executed countless subjects, yet no cruelty he wielded could shield him from the horrific consequences that befell his body. From a modern medical perspective, Herod's final illness can be diagnosed as a complex syndrome involving chronic kidney failure, Fournier's gangrene, and pulmonary edema. Chronic renal insufficiency would have led to uremia, the accumulation of urea and other nitrogenous wastes in his bloodstream, causing relentless itching and fatigue. Without the benefit of antibiotics, his genital region became infected by necrotizing bacteria, resulting in Fournier's gangrene. This pathology describes the rapid necrosis of soft tissue in the perineum, with bacterial toxins liquefying tissue faster than the body could mount an immune response. Finally, as his organs failed, fluid accumulated in his lungs, pulmonary edema, making each breath a struggle, accompanied by bouts of bloody sputum. In Herod's era, physicians could only resort to bloodletting, poultices, and herbal concoctions. They lacked surgical techniques for debridement and had no antimicrobial agents. Maggots feasting on his areas of necrosis, the flow of purulent discharge, and the overpowering stench collectively formed a physical nightmare that no contemporary medical art could remedy. Herod's demise serves as an unambiguous demonstration of the limits of political power and human ambition in the face of nature's immutable laws. No fortress, no army, no cache of wealth can repel the inevitability of aging, disease, and death. A man who once commanded legions and wielded absolute authority over Judea was ultimately defeated by microbial invaders and parasitic larvae. Herod's suffering stripped him of his self-fashioned role as Lord of Creation, reducing him to a specimen in a cruel experiment, showcasing the hubris of despotic rule. Jewish and Roman sources preserve this narrative as a moral admonition to future generations. They warned that rule by force and brutality carries its own reckoning, that a tyrant's power cannot transcend the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human body. This cautionary tale found its way into the annals of classical literature, then into medieval hagiographies and sermons, where Herod's ultimate impotence was contrasted with divine justice. In the realm of literature and art, Herod's grisly end has echoed through the centuries. Renaissance playwrights dramatized his fall in moralistic tragedies, painting him as a cautionary figure whose lust for power led to self-inflicted destruction. In the 19th century, historical novelists wove his final days into Gothic narratives, emphasizing the grotesque decay of his flesh as a symbolic mirror of his corrupted soul. The modern era has seen his story adapted into film and television, often highlighting the most macabre elements, maggots in living flesh. a body slipping from humanity into rot to underscore the extremes of human cruelty and the poetic justice of nature's reprisal. The medieval church used Josephus's account to teach that no matter how lofty a ruler's achievements, they are but dust before divine judgment. Artists from the Baroque period depicted Herod's demise in chiaroscuro, contrasting the darkness of his decaying body with the brightness of celestial light, illustrating the tension between earthly power and spiritual accountability. In contemporary theatre, productions have staged the final scenes of Herod's life as visceral spectacles, employing sound design to mimic the buzz of insects and immersive set elements to convey the stench of decay, thus reminding audiences that beneath the veneer of authority lies the frailty of flesh. Beyond the arts, Herod's story resonates in philosophical and ethical discussions. Scholars cite his final illness when exploring the concept of memento mori, the reminder of death that prompts humility. Medical ethicists reference his case when examining the limits of treatment, historical standards of care, and the evolution of palliative approaches. The gruesome details of infection, gangrene, and respiratory collapse remind practitioners that, despite centuries of scientific advancement, alleviating some forms of human suffering remains a challenge. Herod's enduring legacy thus comprises not only the ports, temples, and fortresses he built, but also the stark reminder that no monument, no matter how grand, can preserve a life from the ravages of time and disease. His reign, celebrated for architectural grandeur, is equally remembered for the cruelty that engendered his final punishment. The tales of his horrifying death have become a timeless allegory. Power unchecked by compassion invites retribution, whether by human hands or the indifferent workings of biology. In this fusion of historical record and moral commentary, Herod's fate continues to echo across generations, cautioning that tyranny and violence ultimately exact their own terrible price. The death of Herod the Great transcends personal tragedy, embodying profound philosophical reflections on the notions of eternity and oblivion. For nearly 4 decades, he strove to etch his name into history through monumental architecture and political machinations. Yet, despite the gleaming stones of the Second Temple expansion, the underwater concrete piers of Caesarea, and the desert fortress of Masada, time reduced these marvels to ruins. What remains of Herod's dream of perpetuity are crumbling walls and half-buried mosaics. Political power, wealth, and architectural glory can magnify the human presence, but they cannot indefinitely defend against the decay of the body or the inexorable flow of years. Within the social fabric of first-century Judea, the tale of Herod's demise inspired enduring lessons about the limits of authority and the corrosive influence of greed. His unremitting pursuit of control, marked by mass executions, high taxation, and intrigues, ultimately betrayed a governance detached from compassion and justice. Generations of storytellers have underscored that a society founded on terror and cruelty cannot endure. Instead, they argue, sustainable communities must rest upon the pillars of fairness, empathy, and respect for human life. Herod's legacy, therefore, serves as a cautionary emblem. Power without moral restraint sows the seeds of its own demise. In religious traditions, Herod's harrowing end was perceived as divine retribution. Within Jewish thought, a rotting corpse is a potent symbol of ritual impurity and divine judgment. The grotesque decomposition of Herod's flesh, chronicled meticulously by Josephus, was held up as evidence that even a king's cruelty could not escape celestial balance. Rabbinic commentaries likened his agonizing death to an act of heavenly justice. The instruments of his violence returned to claim him in the most visceral manner. Thus, his fate became a moral exemplar, warning rulers that persecution and bloodshed invite cosmic reprisal. In modern scholarship, both historians and medical experts continue to revisit Herod's story, to glean insights into ancient pathology, and reflect on the broader historical context. Medical historians have reconstructed his symptoms: chronic kidney failure leading to uremia, Fournier's gangrene of the pelvic region, and severe pulmonary edema, to understand how such a combination could produce the living decay described by Josephus. By comparing these accounts with modern clinical knowledge, specialists confirm that the ancient narratives align with actual disease processes, underscoring the veracity of the reports rather than mere hyperbole. Simultaneously, historians place Herod's final illness within the political and cultural currents of his time. His architectural achievements coincided with an era of complex Roman-Jewish relations, where displaying loyalty to Rome and appeasing local populations required a delicate balance. The very same builders and artisans who constructed his palaces and ports later witnessed their destruction during the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 of the Common Era. Herod's personal fate, then, becomes intertwined with the broader narrative of a region torn between imperial subjugation and the quest for self-determination. Through these interdisciplinary studies, scholars paint a comprehensive portrait of Herod, a ruler of grand ambition and ruthless methods, a patron of monumental works, and a perpetrator of family massacres. His physical demise emerges not merely as an episode of medical horror, but as a reflection of the inherent vulnerabilities of human authority. By examining archaeological remains, medical reconstructions, and literary texts, we come to appreciate both the magnitude of Herod's projects and the fragility of his human form. Ultimately, the death of Herod the Great, with its interplay of disease, necrosis, and parasites, persists as a symbol of individual apocalypse. It reminds us of the fundamental finitude of life and power. No matter how majestic the palace or how well fortified the citadel, the human body remains subject to infection, decay, and death. Herod's story, therefore, compels each person to reflect on the exercise of power, the weight of responsibility, and the consequences of cruelty. In the end, the king who sought to conquer mortality through stone and decree found himself vanquished by the most basic forces of nature, and in that unsettling truth lies his most enduring legacy.